Hey everybody, this is the Wild Ass Podcast, and I am your host, Wild Ass Craig. This is episode 24, and in this episode, you get me. Let me start this off by saying Merry Christmas. It's been a crazy year, and I thank all of you for listening. At the time of posting this, it's Christmas Day, so Merry Christmas to all of you, or whatever holiday you're celebrating. I hope it's great. 2022 has been a crazy year, and I'd like to thank all of you for listening. This episode is just going to be a guy with a podcast talking about his podcast. Just a season wrap-up. As for the podcast, 2022 was a pretty good year considering. I started off with a goal that I thought was pretty attainable. I just wanted to release an episode every other week. This seemed like it would be easy because I also had no intent of editing them before they were being released. This way, I was thinking it would be just a simple record an episode, schedule it to release, move on to the next one. It didn't take long. Before the release of episode 1, actually, I quickly learned that editing was going to be the way to go. This not only makes a better product, but one that even the guests are happy to share. While the first ones may have been a little rough, I do believe that they've gotten progressively better. If you remember all the way back to episode 0, my idea of having a podcast was pushed over the edge after a weekend spent with a bunch of long-distance riders where I got to hear so many of their cool stories. It became my mission to share them here. Along with this, I also wanted to introduce all of you to the amazing people that I have gotten to meet along my journey through the motorcycle industry. With 23 episodes recorded, I don't even feel like I made a dent in the stories that I have yet to get shared with you. It all started with episode 1, where I had Paco on the show with me. I specifically chose Paco as my number one guest because he is the one that I give credit to for introducing me and my company Wild Ass to the long-distance riding community. My relationship with Paco and his friends in this community is all his fault, and I tell him that to this day. Also, how we met, that's a pretty cool story. Episode 2 was with the guy that Paco had turned me on to and really was the next person to rally behind Wild Ass, spreading the word further into the long-distance community. That was with Riot. Riot's now a good friend of mine and one that I talk with pretty much weekly. He then hooked me up with Chris Hopper, who was my episode 3. Hopper is that crazy guy that in 2021 did the impossible. He rode his motorcycle 100,000 miles in just 100 days. That's nothing short of crazy, and to know some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that went on with that ride just baffles me. Hop is a great guy, and another that I'm beyond blessed to have as a friend. These 3 episodes were all about long distance, and it was at this point that I wanted to get some other guests and their stories into the mix. I just wanted to change it up a bit to keep it interesting for those not into the long-distance scene. Episode 4 was John Krotz from J&P Cycles in Daytona, who's been a friend of mine and a huge supporter of Wild Ass for the past number of years. I always look forward to the return trips to Daytona because of John and his crew down at J&P Cycles. Denver Woods, the host of the V-Twin Life podcast, was episode number 5. This was a cool one because we had become friends since we were introduced by the late Leo McElrath from LM4 Photography. What was fun about this one was turning the interview on him. As the interviewer during his own shows, he doesn't normally get that. For the 6th episode, I got to have Joe Byron on, and in that episode, he got to announce his new position with Harley-Davidson of Scottsdale. He's now the GM of this beautiful dealership, and a guy that you definitely want to meet if you're in the Scottsdale area. Episodes 4, 5, and 6 had me now looking into production issues. If you remember those early ones, there were some sound quality things, some clicking, popping, whatever, all that little stuff. But each of those episodes had its challenges in making a good finished product. And it was right in this area that the addition of the soundboard and the recording equipment were added. Back to the shows, I wanted to bring to light in episode 7 a new writer. John Farian has been a friend of mine for decades, and as it turns out, Renee and his wife Edith are cousins, so the connection here runs even deeper than we ever would have thought. I really enjoyed this one because not only is John a friend that now rides, but he has a way with words that's really second to none. I definitely can learn a few things from him. Not only is John a new motorcyclist, but he's also a spokesman for safety in the Pacific Northwest snowmobiling community. Episode 8 brought us Ryan from the 5 Dirty Bikers podcast. Ryan, also known as Kid Moto, is another podcaster and lives not far from me. He actually lives in Grand Forks, North Dakota, which is just a few hours from here in Brainerd. This is a guy that has really been helpful in providing me feedback on my show that I've been able to use to get better. Episode 9 was with Bob Beekman, a distributor rep in the industry who has not only been a Wild Ass supporter, but a friend of mine for years. It was nice to be able to share a story like his, since this is really one of those positions behind the scenes in the industry that are often overlooked. Brett Kent from KST was my guest for episode 10. Getting to know Brett and his family over the past decade has really been an honor, and sharing their story here was really cool. Listening to this episode, you'll know why this is the handlebar that I choose to run on my bike. Ramble from Ride 1K in a Day was my next guest, and in this episode, it was really cool to hear how the 1K challenge started. Being a part of the 1K family was a cool addition for me over the past year. Episode 12 was really special for me. This was Pastor Mike Decker from the Palm Harvest podcast. Mike and I were introduced through my next guest, and for some reason, we really connected and we've become friends. Not only do I look forward to meeting up with him when he's at events, but I even remain in contact with him behind the scenes. The thing I'm really bummed that I missed on this one is I wish I would have had him close out our episode in a prayer. Maybe next time. The next guest was Pastor Mike's cousin, Brian Clock. Episode 13 was the first time that I had purposely scheduled one of these. During the week of June 21, when this episode came out, it happened to be the 25th birthday of Clockworks, so it was the perfect week to have Brian on the show. Totally getting away from the V-Twin world, episode 14 brought us Sean Thomas. Sean is BMW's brand ambassador of the GS line, and after just a brief encounter at the BMW rally in 2021, I would say there's no one better for that job. Getting to know him has been a blast, and the amount of times we've been at the same event since is nothing short of surprising. Sean is also a fellow podcaster and has since turned me on to one of the greatest improvements in the sound quality of the show. As it turns out, there are things out there that help out where a lack of ability shines, and thank you to Sean, now my podcast is sounding better than ever. Ben Fopp was my guest of episode 15, and aside from just being a great guy, he was the top qualifier for USA's GS Trophy team. He's also one of my most requested guests to come back, so I hope to get him on again in the near future to get his story of the competition in Albania. Look for that one coming up. One of my biggest helpers behind the scenes here in the podcast world, and one of my best friends for the last 15 years or so, was my guest on episode 16, and that's Brian Croft. He has lots of podcasting experience, and he now has published over 80 episodes of the Dealership Fix-It podcast. His podcast is more of a behind-the-scenes, industry-focused show. Episode 17 brought us back to the long-distance community with Kimberly Walling. Twister, as she is known, was the first finishing female of the 2022 Hokahay Motorcycle Challenge, and her story is nothing short of impressive. She was also the first female guest of the Wild Ass podcast. Heather Wilson was my guest for episode 18, and we got to hear how she has created her own space in the industry by helping people get support to keep their passions going. Heather and I met in the very early days of Wild Ass at one of the shows, and we have stayed in touch ever since. Seeing her grow her company has been fun, and I really like what she's doing to help keep people going. My guest for episode 19 was none other than my old Monday Facebook show co-host, Joe Johnson. This was a fun one, and just getting more of Joe's story and sharing it with you. Episode 20 was a really cool one for me because this one was with Rob Bidos. As a professional announcer, his ability to carry a conversation is probably what kept this episode going. You could hear in the episode why we get along and have a good time when we meet up on the road at so many of these events. Number 21 brought us Dylan Dwyer in the first episode ever recorded here in person. Dylan is a local friend of mine and is one of my riding buddies here in Minnesota. He went from a guy that just wanted his own sticker to having an Instagram account and being on a podcast all in just a few short months, and he did it all right here. The world-famous Rick Dorfmeyer, to this day, is the rep that has been my favorite to travel with, and he was generous enough to give me his time and become my guest for episode 22. He has plenty more stories to share, and with any luck, we'll get to hear more from him in the future. And that brings us to episode 23. My longest episode ever at just under 2.5 hours was with Alex Brown. I met Alex, also known as Scrubs, in May, and we stayed in contact all the way through the Hoka Hey, where we actually became friends and have stayed in touch ever since. This episode was really cool because in it, he got to share a number of his experiences during the ride. This was a perfect final guest for the end of my first season with the show, and I was excited to share his stories. That brings us to today. I haven't figured out a good way to get numbers on the podcast, so I don't really know how often, on what platform, or where this podcast is played completely. But over the past couple weeks, I got notifications from Spotify and from Apple that were pretty exciting. According to Spotify, evidently we're in the leisure category and have created 88% more content than others in our category. Episode 3 with Chris Hopper was my most played episode, having 156% more streams than my average episode. Spotify also has the Wild Ass Podcast in the top 30% most shared globally. Earlier this month, I got an email from Apple Podcast saying that this show over the last 30 days is currently ranked 123rd in the hobbies category. I don't know how many there are, but it seems like being in the top 100 is within reach. For all of these stats and numbers, I really have to thank you, the listeners, and those of you that are sharing this podcast. I have to thank you. You are the ones that are spreading the word, and I really appreciate it. Along with those thank yous, it looks like that's about all I have for the year in review. Now, for 23, there will be a couple of changes. One of the changes coming, and maybe the most exciting change, is the Wild Ass Podcast will be your source of information for the Mile Monsters. The first Monday of each quarter, you will be able to find out not only what's been going on with the monsters, but also what's coming up in the months ahead. You'll be able to listen at your convenience to get the latest news regarding the efforts of Riot and the gang at the Mile Monsters. Another change, you'll begin hearing ads during the podcast. I'll do my best to keep these ads at the beginning of the show so we don't interrupt the stories that you're listening to. If you're interested in running an ad on the Wild Ass Podcast, shoot me an email and we'll see if we can make something work. For 2023, I'm still going to try and get these out to you every other week, and with currently over a dozen commitments to come on the show, I should be able to keep that schedule. If I can pull that off, it'll put me at 50 episodes by the end of 2023. That's where I would like to end the year. Of course, be sure to hit the subscribe button if you like what you're hearing so you never miss an episode. You can follow the adventures on either Facebook or Instagram by liking and following The Real Wild Ass. As for my personal pages, I am Wild Ass Craig on all of the social media platforms, so please go and give me follows there as well. Now, I have just one more thing for those of you still listening all the way to the end of this episode. We're going to have a little contest. I want you to send me an email that tells me, let's get to 50. You can send that email to therealwildass@gmail.com. Send that to me by the end of the year, Central Time of course, that simply says, let's get to 50. And please, put a note in there with a little feedback on the show. I'm always looking to hear what you like, what you'd like to hear, and especially what I can do to make this show better. Each of the emails I get will be an entry into this contest. I will get all of the entries together, and on the next Wild Ass Wednesday, which is my Facebook show on the Wild Ass page, I will spin the wheel and pick a winner. I will do this during the show that will be at 8 a.m. Central Time on the 4th of January. What could you win? A $50 gift card to the Wild Ass website. If you're watching live and comment during the Wednesday show when I say your name, I will double it. So good luck. I hope all of you are having a great holiday season, and I look forward to our first show of 2023, where I will be right back here with Riot from the Mile Monsters. On that note, we'll see you again in a couple weeks, and of course, thank you again for all of your support.